Hello, welcome to part 24 of toxin sequestration theory. This is my new theory of cancer. I'm very excited about it. And hopefully you've watched some of the earlier videos so you know the basic idea. We are reinterpreting cancer tumors as the body's defense mechanism against toxic overload. And we're thinking of cancer not as a disease, but rather as a symptom of toxic overload. And the same is true with many other conditions where the body builds extra tissue. We all know that obesity is a case where the body builds extra fat tissue. That's another case where the body is using fat tissue to protect the vital organs from toxic damage. The same is true for the skin growths. We've talked about the lipomas and the cherry angiomas and the skin tags and how they store toxins as well. Interestingly, we've also talked about some stones like kidney stones and gallstones. They store toxins as well. Now, today, I'm very excited to add another vault to the list, another storage vault to the list. And it's going to be all about the ovaries. We're going to really dive into the ovaries. I realize that only half the audience has ovaries, myself included. I don't have any, but nevertheless, it's still intellectually interesting, even for those of us who don't have ovaries. And, so we're going to dive into what are the toxins that the ovaries are exposed to and are vulnerable to, and how does the body respond to ovarian toxicity? As you can probably guess, the ovaries are actually highly fatty tissue, and so they're going to tend to respond to fat-soluble toxins. They're going to be sensitive to fat-soluble toxins, I should say. So the lipophilic toxins. But we'll dive into that some more. The backstory, of course, is that the most famous ovarian condition is PCOS, Polycystic Ovary Syndrome. It's been in the news lately because some global experts have tried to rename PCOS, give it a new name. I don't even like the new name. I think it's very unclear. And, I really pride myself on clarity. I will only try to bring clarity to you, not confusion. So despite the fact that the global experts are proposing a new name for PCOS, I will not refer to that new name because it does not bring any clarity, in my opinion, to the situation. So instead, we're going to stick with the old name, which is Polycystic Ovary Syndrome, which of course highlights the fact that there are ovarian cysts that occur. So there are cysts that grow in the ovaries. And so then you're probably thinking in the back of your head, oh, I bet those cysts are going to store toxins. And yes, to spoil it, that is exactly what we're going to find out. The cysts in PCOS store lipophilic toxins. So we're going to dive into that some more. But there's some really interesting and unfortunate correlations with PCOS, which is infertility. So if you look at the WHO's website, the World Health Organization, their website explicitly says that basically the number one cause of lack of ovulation is PCOS. And they say it's a global leading cause of infertility for women worldwide. So they really say that PCOS is causing an infertility epidemic amongst women. Even the mainstream doctors will repeat the exact same thing here in America. So they'll say the exact same thing. And now this is very confusing because they never give any justification for why cysts could cause infertility. How is it that these little cysts are somehow making it impossible to ovulate? They never connect the dots, right? And of course they don't connect the dots because there are no dots to be connected there. The cysts don't cause infertility. And that's going to be a key message of this video, is that the cysts are, not only do they not cause infertility, they actually protect against it. They are actually a protective adaptation to protect you from infertility. My grand theory of disease is that the root cause of all disease is toxicity, right? It's about the toxins. The true bad guys are the toxins. The cysts and the growths, those are the good guys. Those are the guys protecting you from the toxins. Okay, so anyway, so that's the basic idea. And, just to elaborate a little bit more on this, which is that So it is true that PCOS, that is ovarian cysts, can be correlated with infertility, but this is correlation, not causation, right? Correlation, not causation. And the idea, and just to disentangle the confusion, is that there's actually two underlying conditions that people can have, and one is PCOS, the ovarian cysts. The other one is toxin-induced ovarian damage, TIOD. One of those is a disease, and the other one is a protective defense mechanism. You can guess which one is which, okay? So PCOS, the ovarian cysts, are the protective defense mechanism. TIOD is the true disease. That's actually basically what happens when the toxins damage the ovaries. You get potentially infertility. Not only is PCOS not causing the infertility, it is protecting you against the infertility because it's trying to prevent TIOD. And we can understand why PCOS is often correlated with infertility, and that's because the two conditions have a common root cause, right? So the root cause is exposure of the ovaries to toxins, and then it branches out into two potential outcomes, right? You expose the ovary to the toxins, and then you can either get the protective adaptation, which is PCOS, or you can get the disease, the damage, TIOD, which is the bad outcome. But because they share a common root cause, PCOS is indeed correlated with infertility, just because the idea is that many people who have the protective adaptation also might have damage to the ovaries as well, because they're overloading their ovaries with toxins. Okay, that's the basic idea. Now, let's dive into the actual toxins that are responsible for this mess. And so the sort of toxin to ovary mapping is in PCOS are, number one, the forever chemicals, the PFAS. These are the things that are found in the nonstick pans and Teflon. Sometimes they're found in our water supply. And they are considered endocrine disruptors. They do, sort of attack the ovaries. So definitely, if you're worried about, ovaries, you want to protect them from forever chemicals. Number two, there's a long list of toxic metals that also attack the ovaries. These are the heavy metals, especially lead, aluminum, and copper. It's well documented in the literature that elevated levels of copper are correlated with PCOS, and especially an altered zinc-copper ratio. So people who have PCOS often have high copper and low zinc. So that's something to think about, right? Because zinc is protective, copper in excess can be destructive. So that means that zinc can be the good guy in this story. So you can see how you can protect yourself from PCOS with zinc. But anyway, what else? The seed oils and the damaged PFAS, right? So all of the damaged polyunsaturated fatty acids, as well as and the seed oils, those as well are correlated with PCOS. And endocrine disruptors like BPA and phthalates, the xenoestrogens, as well as excess retinoids, so too much vitamin A. Those are all basically fat-soluble toxins. Everything on the list that I just gave you, they're all lipophilic toxins. And because the ovaries are kind of a fatty tissue, it makes sense that those would be sort of attracted to the ovaries. And then, so that's exactly, by the way, what would be sort of stored in the cysts themselves, right? So we can think of the cysts as, in PCOS, as toxin storage vaults. So they store all the chemicals that I just mentioned. And there is, I will give you the evidence for this. There's papers linking forever chemical exposure to PCOS risk. There's papers linking BPA, phthalates, and other endocrine disruptors to PCOS. And as I said, there are medical papers linking elevated copper and altered copper-zinc ratios to PCOS. So I will, in the description of the video, link to some of these papers, just so you know. I'm not making this up. There actually are links between PCOS and these toxins. And so, more broadly, the idea is that there's actually a hierarchy that the body uses when the ovaries are exposed to toxins. And I've talked about this before with other organs, that the body just doesn't go straight to its most advanced strategy. It goes in steps, right? So like when it's first exposed to toxins, then it'll use the primary clearance mechanisms, the liver, the fat tissue, to deal with toxins. So the ovarian cyst would be considered tier 2, right? It's considered a mini vault. So it would be analogous to the skin growths, like the lipomas and the sebaceous cysts, right? It's another type of cyst. We've already talked about, by the way, how sebaceous cysts in the skin store basically the exact same toxins as the ovarian cysts. So these ovarian cysts are directly analogous to the cysts that are in the skin. And they share the same name. They're both called cysts. Anyway, the skin growths are also mini vaults, as well as the gallstones, the kidney stones. So basically, these ovarian cysts fit into this tier 2 category of mini vaults for toxins. Now, when the exposure gets worse, whenever cysts aren't enough to contain the toxic load, then the body escalates to tier 3. Now, as you know, tier 3 are the cancer tumors, right? So now this is where things get interesting. And you might ask, like, oh, is PCOS kind of correlated with a increased risk of cancer tumors? And yes, it is. It has been shown that certain reproductive cancers have a higher risk whenever people have a history of PCOS. And the number one cancer linked to PCOS is endometrial cancer. This is cancer of the uterine lining. And so it is a reproductive cancer. Of course, the uterus is relatively close to the ovaries. So they kind of get exposed to the same sorts of toxins. And so yes, and there is a very clear statistical risk. Like it's well documented in the medical literature, and I'll link to that paper, that people who have a history of PCOS have a higher risk of endometrial cancer statistically. It's like very well documented in correlation. Now you might ask, well, what about like ovarian cancer? And there's a small statistical link with ovarian cancer and PCOS, but it's not as strong as endometrial cancer. And that's very interesting. We might kind of justify that by thinking, well, the ovaries are a very small organ. It's a really small organ. So it's not easy to build multiple vaults on a very small organ. So if the body already is building cysts on the ovaries, there might just be not enough room or space to really build a full-blown ovarian tumor. And instead the body sort of says, well, I've already had my toxin storage vaults on my ovaries. I'm going to go to a different organ for a full-blown cancer tumor. So and naturally the cysts are smaller, so the smaller ovarian cysts kind of suit a small organ much better. So that's sort of my justification where why instead of escalating to ovarian tumors, the body would escalate to tumors in like a nearby organ like the uterus. Just to go back to the idea of how does the mainstream medicine define PCOS? I basically focused on PCOS in terms of the ovarian cysts because I take the word literally. I translate Polycystic Ovary Syndrome into, those are ovarian cysts. But mainstream medicine doesn't like to think literally. They like to confuse and obfuscate. So, whenever mainstream medicine diagnoses PCOS, they actually look at 3 possible symptoms. And the 3 possible symptoms are, number 1, irregular or absent menstrual cycles, basically not ovulating properly. Number 2, elevated androgens. These are like throwing your hormones out of whack, or visible signs of acne or excess hair growth. And then finally, number 3 are the actual cysts, the polycystic ovarian morphology, visible on an ultrasound. And they give a PCOS diagnosis when a woman meets 2 out of those 3 conditions, right? So which means that technically speaking, a woman can get a PCOS diagnosis without actually having ovarian cysts. As you can imagine, I don't really like that. I think that's actually very confusing. Why would you give someone a PCOS diagnosis if they don't have cysts? And so, I prefer my framework, which is the TST framework. In the TST framework, like I said, you have a underlying root cause, which is the toxic load on the ovaries, right? And then when you have this underlying root cause, it can branch out into two branches. You either have protective adaptations or you have ovarian damage. Now, the ovarian damage is the infertility. That's the sort of first symptom on the medical systems list, is the infertility. The protective adaptations are the other symptoms. It's the elevated androgens, the insulin resistance, and the cysts, right? Now, let's dive a little deeper into those protective adaptations. I've already talked about how the cysts themselves can be protective by storing toxins and sequestering the toxins away from the ovaries, because it protects the ovaries from the toxic damage. So the cysts are protective, but there's other things that happen in PCOS, namely insulin resistance and the elevated androgens, that also can be interpreted as being protective. So I've talked in some other videos about insulin resistance, and so some of you might know my views on that. It's very common for people to blame insulin resistance as being a disease or a cause of all kinds of health problems. That is not my view at all. Glucotoxicity, which is the toxicity of sugar, is a real disease. So glucose overload and having too much glucose, that is a tissue damaging situation. Insulin resistance, on the other hand, is the body's protective adaptation to glucotoxicity. When you have too much glucose and other types of sugars as well in your bloodstream and in your body fluids, then the peripheral tissues have to basically close their doors to accepting glucose. The analogy I like to give is that imagine that there's all these stray cats roaming on the street, and you want to kind of be a team player and help out the stray cats. So initially you accept, one or two stray cats into your house, and you're like, sure, I'll take a couple of stray cats. But eventually you've got like 10 stray cats in your house, and you're like, I'm sorry, I'm closing my doors shut to stray cats, and I cannot accept any more cats anymore into my house, because, otherwise it's going to destroy my house, right? The same idea. If you accept too much glucose into your house, it's going to destroy your house. So these peripheral tissues, these and other organs, not just peripheral tissues, also vital organs like the liver and ovaries, etc., can develop insulin resistance, which means that they do not want any more glucose. They're shutting their doors to glucose. So insulin resistance is a protective adaptation, and it protects the tissues from glucotoxicity. And similarly, the androgen shifts that people see in PCOS could be viewed as protective adaptations to deal with toxins, because some of these androgens might themselves help to bind to toxins. Maybe certain androgens can help to bind or mobilize or sequester some of these toxic chemicals. And so it looks like the body is basically shifting its production of androgens to deal with the toxicity itself. So we're reinterpreting the elevated androgens as, the body is, basically producing some defense chemicals to defend itself from toxins. Okay, so that summarizes the protective adaptations in PCOS. As I said, insulin resistance, elevated androgens, and the ovarian cysts can all act as defense mechanisms against toxic overload. None of them cause infertility. It's the toxins that cause the infertility, because the toxins cause direct damage to the ovaries. And of course, this gives a line of action for people. Obviously, if you're worried about infertility and damage to the ovaries, then the first thing you should think about is reducing your toxic load, reducing your exposure to seed oils and other lipophilic toxins. And I have advocated for a carnivore diet because if you go on a muscle meat focused carnivore diet, I do not recommend eating liver, by the way, because liver stores toxins. But if you go on a muscle meat focused carnivore diet, then you are eliminating tons of toxins, and that includes not just the seed oils, but also the heavy metals, the excess copper, the aluminum, and etc. It goes on and on. The non-heme iron, but also the plant toxins, and there's a very long list of toxins, including the lipophilic toxins that would damage the ovaries, that you eliminate by going on a carnivore diet. Now, some of these toxins, like the forever chemicals and the BPA and the phthalates, those are maybe more challenging to eliminate because they are environmental toxins. They're in plastics, and that you have to think carefully about. Obviously, filter your water. Like, first and foremost, make sure you're always drinking clean water, and because many of those chemicals are in the water supply, and you have to filter them out. Of course, there's other things you can think about. Your cookware, because PFAS are in nonstick cookware as well. But needless to say, the best way, it appears, to prevent both PCOS and ovarian damage is to reduce your toxic load and reduce your exposure to toxins, get on a clean diet, get the toxins out of your life. And I did just want to give a nice analogy here, because the situation with the ovaries looks very similar to the brain for me, because when the brain is under toxic load, once again, there are two different possible outcomes. One is you get a brain tumor, and the other is you get a neurodegenerative condition like Alzheimer's. Now, one of those is a protective response, the brain tumor, whereas the other one is an actual real disease. And obviously, having the protective response is better than having the disease. And then the same is sort of analogous to the ovaries, right? So, but in the brain, the idea is that the brain tumor is trying to prevent the Alzheimer's from happening. And similarly, the PCOS in the ovaries is trying to prevent the ovarian damage from happening. So we have this nice analogy between the brain and the ovaries. So I just want to remark that finding this discovery that PCOS fit into my TST theory was such a pleasant surprise and such a very exciting eureka moment. I was so happy to realize that PCOS fit into TST, and so it really felt amazing to unify, this other condition, which no one thinks is related to cancer, of course, and realize that it's actually very closely related to cancer. And in fact, it's a risk factor for cancer, and it's actually just a precursor to cancer. It is something that the body does before it does reproductive cancer. So before you get full-blown reproductive cancer tumors, you get, say, ovarian cysts. And so it's like a tier below cancer. And now I'm trying to remove the fear from these growths. So I'm trying to remove the fear. Do not fear the cysts. Do not fear the growths. Do not fear the tumors, right? They are the good guys. What you should fear are the toxins and the damage the toxins cause. Let me know what your thoughts are on PCOS. Thanks everyone for listening. Have a great day.